I'm going to go ahead and get started as people are trickling in. So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this evening or afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. My name is Rebecca. I'm the events director for Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally. And I'm going to start out with a really brief presentation about Engineers and Scientists, or ESAL for short, and what we're all about. You'll hear about our partner for this event as well. And then I'll introduce the panelists and we'll go right into discussion. So brief PowerPoint. And someone, a panelist, let me know if there's any issues with screen or audio as this goes along. So Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally is a volunteer national organization dedicated to increasing local civic engagement by people with STEM backgrounds. It was launched by engineers and scientists who have some expertise in public policy. And it is a 501c3 nonprofit. And so I said that, we're involved in encouraging people to get engaged with their local governments and communities, but what does that actually look like? So we have a variety of resources. We have a blog on our website where we feature different people, ideas, and organizations that are really at the intersection of science and local policy or community engagement. So it's a really great place to go to look for examples of what that type of engagement can look like. We also have a resources page, including a database of different local organizations, as well as a step-by-step playbook about how to do things like advocate for policy or join a local board or commission. Then we hold events just like this one that help to, again, highlight great examples of people working in this space, as well as give you an opportunity to connect and learn more about how to engage in different issues. And if you're interested in getting involved with ESAL, we always really welcome engagement. So there's lots of ways that you can be involved. We are always hoping for people to get in touch via email or social media. We'd love for you to reach out. You could write a blog post if you've been doing some great work in your community or you're with an organization. You can check out some past examples of who we featured at our website. You can volunteer with us. We do have currently some open volunteer positions with our virtual events team, which would be organizing events just like this, with our web team. And also, if you have experience in database management, we have a couple really cool projects coming up around that. And we also can, upon request, organize local engagement workshops. And I now want to say that we are incredibly grateful to be partnering with the SciTech Institute for this event. Particularly Claire Conway has been a great help, and I'm going to give her a chance to say a few words about their organization and what they do. So Claire, feel free to unmute and take it away.
Hi everyone, I'm Claire. Thank you for the introduction, Rebecca. We're so excited to be a part of this event. So before we get started, I'd like to share just a little bit about what we do at SciTech. We have a couple of really big programs, but what I'd really like to highlight is our STEM ecosystem, which is a grassroots network of folks all over the state working in all different areas. We've got educators, businesses, nonprofit, local government, students, all sorts, all working together around STEM and STEM education in Arizona. We're a part of the National STEM Ecosystem Initiative, and our goal is to really create meaningful cross-sector collaborations around STEM and to share resources and align efforts that are happening in STEM education and workforce all around the state. We've also got our Chief Science Officers Program, or CSOs, in which 6th through 12th grade students are elected or selected to be STEM ambassadors in their school. And over the course of the year, they design and implement an action plan, things like hosting a career panel or starting a STEM club at their school, STEM morning announcements, cleaning up a park. And then they work to increase awareness and excitement around STEM among their peers. And then lastly, we also host the Arizona SciTech Festival, which is a huge celebration of STEM that happens every year over 2 months, February and March, all over the state. And so through the festival, we have thousands of events like tours and workshops and panels, science fairs. So there are all sorts of really cool ways to get involved there. I know we have people on this call from all over the place and not just in Arizona, but if you'd like to hear more about our ecosystem or any of our other programs, I would totally love to connect with you. So I'll send my email and our website in the chat in just a moment. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Claire. And finally, before we get started, I just want to note that you may have seen we do have part 2 of this STEM education series that's coming up later this month. So if you haven't, you can still register for that. And it will be focused around how teaching and curriculum design can advance equity and justice in STEM. And I do want to highlight my friend and colleague, Dr. Dipali Raval, who has been my co-organizer for this entire panel, and she'll actually be the guest moderator for that event. So Dipali is an educator and scientist. She currently serves as the Director of Education for the Harvard Graduate Program in Bacteriology and Infectious Disease Consortium, where she leads the development of innovative, inclusive curriculum for biology and public health grad students. She's also committed to supporting access to science careers for youth from communities that face health injustices, and she's worked closely with local programs like the Harvard Health Professions Recruitment and Exposure Program, as well as national initiatives like the CDC Science Ambassador Fellows Program. So thanks to Polly for your help. Just wanted to give a particular shout out to her here. Great, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our 4 really amazing panelists that we have for today. So we have Dr. Kayla Davis, who grew up in Stillwater, Oklahoma, where she received her bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Oklahoma State University. Kayla is a citizen of the Osage Nation and a recent graduate of Harvard University, where she received her PhD in biological and biomedical sciences. Dr. Davis is currently a postdoctoral fellow in neurology at Harvard Medical School. Inspired by her upbringing in Oklahoma and local pitfalls in education funding, Kayla and her graduate student peers founded a STEM education nonprofit, CodeSci Lab, which you'll hear more about today. And CodeSci Lab has a mission of improving access to science education by providing free and low barrier to entry computational science programming that meets next generation science standards for computer science in Oklahoma and beyond. We also have on the call with us Dr. Jeremy Babinder. Dr. Babinder's passion is to enhance community awareness and engagement in STEM through the establishment of broad-reaching STEM initiatives that draw on diverse partnerships from education, community government, and business. Through combined efforts of the Arizona SciTech Festival, the Arizona STEM School Community of Practice, and the Chief Science Officers Initiative, Dr. Babinder has helped engage 800 plus organizations from 30 plus communities to engage over 400,000 people annually. Prior to his work in Arizona, Dr. Babinder helped launch the Science Bridge program with his doctoral advisor in San Diego, California, which impacted 200 teachers, 20,000 students, and 60,000 community members each year. We'll also be hearing from Dr. Monica Taylor, who serves as the Vice Chair on the Delaware County Council. She is also a professor and program director in the kinesiology department of the University of Sciences in Philadelphia. In addition to her teaching, research, and administrative duties, Monica is working on community outreach projects to educate high school students about future careers in the healthcare industry. She spearheaded a project called Early STEAM, working in local Philadelphia elementary schools to introduce young students to science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And prior to serving on the County Council, Monica served on the Upper Darby School Board and the Delaware County Intermediate Unit Board of Directors. And then lastly, we have Mr. Andres Henriquez, who is currently the Director of STEM Education Strategy at the global nonprofit, the Education Development Center, or EDC. A national expert in science, educational technology, and policy, Henriquez is deeply committed to making a difference in the lives of underserved children. For decades, he has worked to achieve this goal as an educator, researcher, advocate, and funder. He has led work in adolescent literacy and college and career readiness standards and assessment, including the writing and adoption of the next generation science standards. Previously, Henriquez served as program director for the National Science Foundation and a program officer for the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So a huge welcome to all of our panelists, and thank you for being here today. And just to give folks sort of a rundown of what to expect, we have 3 sort of main discussion points that we want to walk through today. And then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So if you think of a question as you're listening to our panelists, feel free to put it either into the chat or to the Q&A box which I will be monitoring. So these are all pretty big picture questions. Discussion question 1 is, in the areas where you've lived and worked, do students face barriers to STEM educational access? And if so, what are these barriers and how are they influenced by the specific context of your state and local community? So I will start with Jeremy, if that's okay, and then we'll just go around.
That's a pretty, broad question. So I think everybody's going to have some similarities in that, some differences. Maybe I'll start with something that's unique to Arizona is our geographic space. We're, one thing people talk about rural communities, we're pretty vast. Like there's places in Arizona where you might travel 3-4 hours to get to a place and there's almost nothing in between. And so there's a lot of regions in Arizona that have a lot of challenges with access, broadband access, education access. And one thing was interesting when we started working with some rural initiatives that we have, talked to one mayor in a place called Safford, Arizona, and he's like, "You ever heard of the STP rule?" And I'm like, "I don't know what that means." He's like, "It's the same 10 people." And it's one of the challenges that a lot of the rural communities have, which is that there's a set of people that are basically engaged in everything. And everybody's trying to go out to the same people working with them on those initiatives. And I think that same idea trickles down to the students, because you're trying to do one initiative or another, that these rural schools try to have as much as these urban groups have. And yet now the students are involved with like 4 clubs, or, they're part of the, football team or the different sports teams. And it then becomes so much overload, along with these compounded challenges of just the vast distance. And so it's something that's an interesting kind of, at least equity piece just to highlight in Arizona. And I imagine some of my colleagues on the call can talk more about like the challenges in urban areas as well. But it's kind of a unique thing to Arizona just to highlight is, how do you really meet those needs and serve that and really build that out? And that's kind of one thing just to highlight that. And we started to do some work in the space of building geographic STEM hubs as part of this national ecosystem work. How do we really start to pull common allies together to hopefully streamline these connections, so that if, for example, I was on the call just earlier with an energy company, Salt River Project, and they really want to support infrastructure development on the Navajo and Apache reservations. Like they cannot get, for example, running water is a challenge that they're dealing with out there. Who do they work with? How do they make that happen? It turns out we have a group of about 12 people as part of our project that they can now network with. And as opposed to spending their time trying to rebridge these connections, they can now really start to make that happen. And that exists in many levels with the school districts, with community organizations, but really starting to build that ecosystem infrastructure in these underserved regions is kind of an important next step that we're hoping to really build, and have started to work on that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think I'll move now to Kayla. I know you mentioned in your bio that you were really inspired by the area you grew up in. So, what is it about that local environment and some of the unique challenges that made you want to work, kind of go back home, sort of figuratively, and work in that space?
Sure. Thank you for my introduction, Rebecca. So, as I mentioned, I grew up in the state of Oklahoma, and there really are some specific issues to the state of Oklahoma that are, happening all over the country as well, that are specific to education and education funding. And I want to talk about these specifically because I think that these are things that can, be changed through advocacy and policy. And so, just a couple of things to go through and things that really motivated me to try to reach out to this specific community. And the state of Oklahoma has been facing severe education budget shortfalls for really more than the last 10 years now, since about the time I graduated high school and beyond in 2010, the education budget has been cut. This is having really serious impacts all over the state, and it's severely impacting rural communities the most. And so a couple of things that have happened because of this. Over 100 districts in the state, it's about 20% of the districts in the state, are operating on 4-day school weeks right now. This is a measure that was taken specifically to try to help with education budgeting, saving money on things like busing, especially in these rural districts where students are being bused, upwards of 20 miles to school. This actually saves a lot of money there. So, what that has resulted in is the state actually having an equivalent requirement of 165 days of instructional time in the state. That's, really low when most states in the country are requiring 180 days of instructional time. These same budget shortfalls have affected things like teacher hiring practices. So some of you may remember Oklahoma being on the news a couple of years ago for mass teacher walkouts. And the reason that that was happening was because Oklahoma teachers were being paid much less than teachers in surrounding states. Teachers were fleeing the state in droves to go to higher paid positions, and they were working in conditions that were severely underfunded. So some of these teachers that were protesting for things like funding in their schools to fix the leaks in their ceilings in their classroom, funding to buy new desks because not all of their teachers had all their students had chairs that they could sit in that were not broken. Just really simple things in these rural districts where these year-over-year budget cuts added up. So you can imagine how this could impact, not only the educators, but the students in these districts who are trying to learn. You're trying to sit in science class and your ceiling is leaking. You don't have a desk that's, not wobbling, these kind of things, right? So these specific budget shortfalls have really added up in the state. And another measure that the state has taken to respond to this is they've started emergency certifying teachers. And this has specifically affected more STEM classes than other fields. So what emergency certification is, it means if there's an open teaching position in the state that they cannot fill with a teacher who has the typical requirements, then they will hire someone to fill this position, usually someone with a college degree, but not necessarily a background in the field that they're teaching. So you can imagine how this could be, especially impactful in STEM classes where you have someone trying to teach, calculus, physics at the high school level. They don't necessarily have a college degree in this background. It provides a lot of challenges, and specifically rural districts are having a really hard time recruiting talent and educators to their districts to teach in these small towns, especially in some of these STEM fields. So it's having a huge, huge impact on STEM education and education more broadly. And then I'll just mention one other thing is that Oklahoma and many other states have passed legislation that require computer science instruction at the high school level, but schools across the country are really struggling to fill these positions. So that's something that we are seeing time and time again. Schools in Oklahoma that we've talked to through our outreach with CodeSci Lab really want to offer these computer science education classes. They have it in their curriculum, their districts want them to do it, but they're having a hard time finding the teachers to come into these classrooms who have the right background. And so this is really, affecting the students who would like to learn these topics, but just don't have the resources available to them.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, highlighting a lot of important issues that folks in other parts of the country may not really be seeing. I'll move on to Monica. You have a really unique perspective on this because you've been more involved in the policy side of things, sitting on local boards. What's your take on sort of the important barriers coming from a local context and maybe from a more policy side of things?
Well, I mean, I'm also going to speak about school funding as a major barrier to STEM education in the state of Pennsylvania. So our funding formula is a little bit different than other states, and the state of Pennsylvania has really adopted a system of funding public education that does not provide the resources that students need to meet state standards. And it also discriminates against students based on where they live and the wealth of their local communities. And so when I'm talking about this, the state provides about 34% of funding, with almost 60% coming from local sources, which this type of situation creates large disparities between the wealthy and underserved areas in the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania ranks, it fluctuates from year to year between 49th and 50th in the country on disparity and difference between the poorest districts and the wealthiest districts. Just in my county alone, we have 15 school districts, and the difference in per pupil spending is the lowest school district is spending about $8,000 per student, per pupil, and the highest, the wealthiest district in my county is spending about $22,000 per pupil. And that's all public education. And so with this type of funding system, it really makes it hard for those districts who are just struggling to simply update their curriculum on a regular basis to initiate any sort of STEM programs, along with the ability to recruit and retain teachers who are in the STEM fields. And so the school funding issue is really a problem.
That's really eye-opening. Thanks for that perspective. And then last, I'll go to you, Andres. You've worked across a lot of different communities. Are these similar themes or patterns that you've seen emerge, or is there anything sort of unique from the perspectives you've had in terms of sort of the key barriers to STEM education? Oh, you're muted.
That'll be the quote of 2021. Hello, everyone. So nice to have you all here, and thanks for joining us. Yeah, I think that there are similar issues. Certainly, there are some of funding, but I want to make sure that folks really also understand that there's a lack of emphasis of science in our country. That we probably spend and I'm talking about New York City, but I think it applies to places around the country. There's probably about 20 minutes of instruction in science per week, which is not very good, if you ask me. I think that there needs to be more of an emphasis on science and what science, how science can actually produce the next generation of innovative thinkers and manufacturers and the future workforce, right? That's one thing. Certainly we have the right tool sets in place. We have a number of really fantastic standards for the next generation science standards. There are more curricula that's being in place around the country for that align to the next generation science standards, and it's just a lack of public will, I think, in terms of the work that's going on. A few days ago, the National Academies Board on Science Education released a call to action to the nation about how we really need to emphasize science in schools. So I'm hoping that gets a lot of traction. One of the other things I want to say is that the job I had before this one is at the New York Hall of Science Science Museum, and I worked specifically in a hyperlocal way with the Latinx community. One of the things that sometimes parents don't understand, particularly parents for first generation families, are that that science could be learned in schools, but it also goes beyond schools. And sometimes the understanding of that places, after school programs, museums, and so forth, are places where learning can take place. Yes, there's terrific programs around gym and swim and computers, technology and computer science, but there are all kinds of ways in which that is taking place. I think from my experience, there was a sense of parents really not understanding that science, the way it is learned, that there's a lot of tinkering and a lot of inquiry that goes on, and parents often think that there's like a one right answer to a problem. And so we need to really work to make sure that parents and families understand the ways in which science is structured and the ways in which they could both work with science in not only in these informal learning areas, but also that they can do these kinds of things at home. So that and that learning science is not just in books, even though they do come from rich resources. That science can be done in lots of different ways.
Yeah, that's great, and thanks for adding that perspective. I'm going to move on to our next question, which is also a very big topic. So nationwide, certain demographics, including women and people of color, remain underrepresented in scientific fields. And obviously, this is a super complex issue, and it goes well beyond just the K-12 education age, but what are the factors that are driving these disparities at the K-12 level based on your experience, and how can people or organizations working in STEM education try to address this? So I'll start this time with Kayla.
Sure. So my answer is lack of experience. So going through the Oklahoma school system, working with students there, even students like myself growing up who are really enthusiastic about STEM, just have very little exposure to the types of, often have very little exposure to the types of careers that they can pursue beyond medicine. So even though I love my science classes, I thought, you know, I'm going to be a medical doctor. That is my only option. I did not know that becoming a scientist was a real option for me. Until I spent a summer working with a university professor in her lab and saw what that looked like. And so I think in many cases, you know, it's lack of exposure of knowing what's out there, but also lack of hands-on experience, right? So in many of these schools in Oklahoma or underfunded school districts across the country, many students may not actually have much hands-on experience with science in the lab, trying these things, getting their hands dirty, right? And it takes this hands-on experience to really feel this like enthusiasm, right? Who's going to be excited about a job that, you know, they've never seen in person before, they've never tried before. And so I think that this exposure is huge. And, you know, a lot of the programs that are being featured today are going for this goal. And I think that's so important. And then, you know, beyond that, I want to talk about, you know, lack of exposure of folks who look like students who are underrepresented in scientific fields, right? So as a Native American woman in science, I know that Native American women are vastly underrepresented in the science field. I have a PhD in biomedical sciences. I have never in person met another Native American woman who has a PhD in my field. We are vastly underrepresented, and that has a huge impact. Who I do know are other Native American women who have tried to pursue PhDs in science and who were failed either by their institutions or their advisors and left without their degrees. And so I think one thing that's really important if we want to see more students pursue STEMs and careers in STEM, we really need to first support the people that they would look up to, right? People that they can relate to. It's not enough to just get people to pursue these careers, to pursue this education and get their college degree. We really have to support them through that so that they can set an example in their community.
Thanks. That's a great point that we can't really disentangle like higher education equity issues from this question. I'm going to move to Monica. I think you touched around this when you mentioned the different economic disparities in funding, but can you also speak to specifically sort of barriers to underrepresented groups in STEM, and maybe from your perspective, you've started a lot of initiatives of what organizations or people can do to try to start addressing this.
Yes, I mean, you know, there are several studies that have shown that, you know, creating informal STEM education opportunities within underserved areas and for underrepresented groups can help to reduce some of those barriers and really create better representation in STEM careers in the future. And so it's really that exposure and access that Kayla was talking about. The more exposure that students have in that K-12 level, the more opportunities they have to learn about the areas that they can go into in STEM education. For example, we started 2 different programs out of our university. One is Early STEAM, and that's really aimed at just introducing kids to fun, tinkering STEM activities in the K-2 grades, right? Just really early on. And then the Health Career Academy is focused at looking at, and both of these programs are in inner city Philadelphia, trying to introduce underrepresented areas that maybe might not have a chance to be introduced to these careers. And our Health Career Academy is really looking at introducing high school students to the other careers that they can go into in the health career industry. You know, when we go in on the first day and meet with these students, we do like a little pre-test, right? We ask them, you know, what have you heard of? What are jobs that you could think of? And, you know, the majority of them are like, oh, it's a doctor, it's a nurse. And, you know, we're exposing them to, well, okay, yes, those are options, but there's also research. There's also a pharmacist, there's a physical therapist, there's an occupational therapist. You know, so we're trying to expose them to the other areas that there are. And we go through, you know, case studies with them. We have somebody comes into the ER. What do you do as the different professions? And they get to work through with one of those professionals. what they would do during that. And, by the end, there's students who are like, I didn't know what that was, or I had never even heard of this position before. And it's really just that exposure and getting them more access to it and really that hands-on, because that makes them really excited about doing it. And so I just piling on to some of what Kayla was saying earlier.
Yeah, that's really great. And that actually that reminds me of DePauli I introduced at the beginning is involved in a similar program, and the importance of programs like that for also addressing like health disparities as well, sort of down the road. So that's such a great point, and it's such a great thing to be involved with. I'm going to move on to Andres. What are your perspectives on this?
Hi. Yeah, I think, similarly to what Monica and Kayla are saying, I think what the notion of what STEM is not really clear to parents and children who are pursuing or thinking about careers. I think when people imagine, what you want to do for a living, people understand what a teacher is. They know what a lawyer does, sort of. They know what a doctor is. They know what a policeman is. They know what a fire. The range of skill sets that we need for people in our knowledge economy is shifted so much, and the kinds of things that are happening in companies, we just need many more STEM people who have sort of experienced STEM, the STEM way of thinking, if you will, and not necessarily just graduating engineers and just graduating scientists. We need to really expose a whole lot more youngsters to the kinds of jobs that are out there that exists. In New York City, for example, we have a huge entertainment industry, NBC, CBS, ABC, etc. And they're eager to hire folks who are really STEM focused, STEM knowledgeable. People don't think about that when they think about STEM majors, that they can go into television. You don't need to be an actor. You can there are lots of behind the scenes things that are going on. It's a huge industry, as you can all imagine. I think one of the other things, so getting that kind of work, to Monica's point, one of the things we did at the New York Hall of Science is expose a lot of young people to different career trajectories within STEM. So we would have the oil and gas company there who would come. We would have people from entertainment industry. We'd have people from who were wine growers outside of New York City. Those kinds of things, and the kinds of things that people need to know about that. The perfume industry, etc. A wide range of things that both people of color, young women could really engage with. It's not just having a lab coat and walking around a pharmaceutical. The other thing is, I think one of the dissuaders, I think, is the sort of weeding out process that is still very much happening in colleges, where people may come very excited about STEM, and we need to untangle that STEM process, but they're still they're thinking that STEM is for some and not for all, and I think we need to do a lot of work to change that dialogue, particularly in the in colleges and universities, where the tracks are just sort of made for engineers and doctors. So I'm hoping that we get some attention on the case, not just K-12, but in the post-secondary level.
Yeah, definitely. Very important emerging theme. And then finally, Jeremy, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think our perspective, some of it has really been an approach of what we might call like a cultural hack, of really how to change just the general, public community opinions on STEM or what it's about. And I think it ties in with what Kayla was talking about with like mentorship and kind of who's there to begin with that inspiration. And so one of the places we started was building these science festivals and trying to get science as part of regular community opportunities. And it was interesting, we started doing these events and we would have them at places, started in San Diego, we had like a Balboa Park where people would go to, or in Arizona, we've had them in city squares, we've had them all over the place in community settings. And What's been interesting is the field, is we found that even though the whole intent was to try to build and diversify, it tended to be high SES, kind of your regular festival goers. And so what we found was trying to do events that were more on totally engaged in community settings where you had a diverse community. Part of it really made the impact. So for example, one of the events that happened was called the Innovation Nation, and they actually had the event on the White Mountain River Apache Nation. And lo and behold, when you take the demographics, 98% of the people are indigenous because you happen to have them engaged in doing it. So I think a lot of it is really thinking about how do you engage the people there, and almost like if you're working in a place, how to have people recognize that they are engaged in STEM. If somebody is an auto mechanic, or if they're an assistant in a dental office, whatever it might be, people use technology and they are STEM professionals. It's getting them to kind of self-empower to recognize that they also can do that, and then communicate that to their community. I think that's where these kind of approaches to really get the whole community, get the parents and the families and people they look up to be part of it. And that I think is one part of increasing the role models and a piece of that. The second kind of cultural hack that I think we tried after was these chief science officers, and really getting students to be these advocates for STEM. And what's been really exciting is that over half of our students are female. You know, when we look at just white males, it's only 20% of the population of the students. So we do find that diverse demographics are wanting to be in these leadership positions. And then pairing that with organizations like us that have the connections, that have the network. So we've worked through a lot of the STEM ecosystem communities that are working with policy leaders, community leaders, government leaders to have the students really get in front of that. And, you know, one example, when we started the first year of the program, there was a girl in one of the Avondale school districts, and her name, we call her CSO Marie is her name. And she, you know, when we talked to the superintendent, like she was like, went out to dinner, she's like, this is like one of the 2 times in the year her family is going to go out to dinner, like in terms of the SES level. But she actually went with us. We visited OSTP, we presented in front of Megan Smith and John Holdren, and she just had the most confidence and charisma you'd ever see. And she was just talking about how when she's excited about it, her friends tend to be part of it and follow that too. And so there's a lot of potential and agency that the kids have in terms of doing that to really reverse the tide, to make that happen. But I think one thing, just from watching my wife's story, there's some underlying systems in terms of building that mentorship beyond that. So my wife made it through, she has a PhD in that, but she had our first child while she was in grad school. And it's interesting to watch how they approached her about having a baby when in grad school, as opposed to like supporting her and giving her health coverage. It was actually, they encouraged her to leave, and if she stayed, she would have to pay for her own medical insurance. And it's almost like graduate students were treated as a second class citizen. And this is across the board. And, you know, if you're thinking about when you're going to have a child and you're in grad school and you're female, it's probably around that age, like 20, 24 to 30. And there's systems like that really bias towards not, you know, from a gender equality piece that could really make a difference. Fortunately, her boss is like, this is stupid. We can't do that. You need to do what you can. But this is, you know, an example of a system that, you know, if you keep on looking, or if the male has a wife that is having a baby, they're going to be treated very differently. Oh, we're going to give you support and time off. The female wasn't given that. And so there's a lot of systems that are just ingrained that we're not even putting attention to, that also then long term will then have an effect on why aren't there as many females in the academic system being those mentors. And that's just one example. So anyway, those are 3 kind of ideas that might kind of build upon what everybody else was talking to.
Yeah, those are great illustrative examples. And I love the concept of like students being themselves, like the agent for change and sort of pulling each other along. That's very cool. I'm going to move on to the next discussion point, focuses around how, because I think it's probably interest of a lot of folks on this call, how they can get engaged further in STEM education. So I sent around a couple hours before this event, whoever's registered, unless you register within like the last 20 minutes, in which case you might not have gotten it, but I will send it afterwards as well. I sent around this PDF. So I'll send this around as well, but this is, should serve as a resource document includes both information about the speakers for this panel and the second panel later this month, but also some key learning materials. That call to action report that Andres mentioned is linked here if you're interested in taking a look at that. Resources from ESAL, as well as a bunch of opportunities, both national and a few that are local for getting involved. So some are more mentoring opportunities. I've listed some advocacy organizations. Clearly, we've heard from this call that sort of advocacy around things like funding is a really key issue. Organizations, a lot of these I got from Claire, thank you, with that really work around spotlighting diversity in STEM and have opportunities for scientists to contribute examples or to join those communities and act as sort of mentors or role models. So I will again send that around to everyone after this, but I wanted to use that as sort of a launching point, and also to note that if anyone, either panelists or attendees, have examples of other organizations, feel free to follow up via email or put them in the chat, and I can add those in as well. Also, some of the panelists' own organizations are listed as volunteer opportunities, and I'll let them talk about that. So the final sort of big discussion point for all of the panelists today is drawing on your own experiences. What advice would you give to people who are looking to get involved in STEM education? And we'll start this time with Monica.
I guess some of the advice that I would give to folks that are looking to get involved with STEM education is really looking at what you have in your community and how you can leverage the stakeholders that are in your community to help provide better STEM education. Because sometimes, as I talked about, and Kayla talked about, I think others mentioned, there are barriers that have to do with school funding. And so if a school isn't able to access something because of their normal funding, then thinking outside the box and bringing maybe universities involved or the local health network involved. And so just thinking about the program that we had, our Health Career Academy, that's our university going into the local high schools in Philadelphia and working along with Mainline Health, which is one of the hospital networks in the surrounding Philadelphia area, to put that program into play. So trying to think really outside the box is how you can leverage your community and the stakeholders to improve STEM education in your local community.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think we'll jump next to Andres.
Yeah, hi. So, yeah, I think there are a number of things that are going on simultaneously. I think many of you have heard about the STEM ecosystems that are now, they're 94 strong around the country. And if you looked up STEM ecosystems, you could probably find one pretty close to your community. And these ecosystems are collaborations between schools, nonprofits, businesses, and of course they range and they vary in a number of ways, but you might want to see who's leading those ecosystems and see if there is a need for volunteers and or engagement of some way. Another place I'd check is the national national museums, national science museums. These are museums. There are science museums all around the country. There are about 700 around the country. And even though they're pretty well established in terms of staffing, they always need folks that could volunteer to do work in their after-school programs and things like that. And I'm sure if you looked, there's probably one very close to your homes. I think lastly, one of the things there are lots of nonprofits besides that are doing interesting work around STEM. The 4-H clubs, the 4-H clubs, Boys and Girls Clubs, have fantastic programs, and sometimes the range of folks that can do it and B, teach it with high quality is very difficult. Sometimes they don't get the right people, but asking them to volunteer would be great. The other thing, lastly, I would say that it's really interesting. One of the things that I've learned is that working with folks within their communities and really understanding and embracing the cultural their culture and seeing the best of their culture and seeing ways in which you can embed STEM within that, or highlight what in their culture there is there are cultural things within their cultures that could be emphasized. There's sewing and cooking and model making and auto mechanics and things like that. So I just wanted to make sure that wherever you go, wherever you do work, that the emphasis on culture and the ways in which you could really highlight people's cultures could really be really useful. I want to point to Megan Bang's work and Carrie Zhu's work, learning in places, I believe, and they have a really good documentation of things that are going on around STEM and culture. So you might want to check those out, and I'll put those up on the chat.
Great, thank you. That's also a good reminder, and for our next month's or the next panel in this series on the 27th, we'll be talking a lot about curriculum and cultural development curriculum. And that's also, I think you mentioned STEM ecosystems, so that's of course a really great transition to Jeremy.
Yes. Yeah, ecosystems is great, and probably depends, and that is good note in each of your communities. There are close to 100 of them now. So they're going to have a lot of the ties, but I think it's a pretty, in a way, it's a difficult question. So I think the ways people can get involved, a lot of it depends upon kind of who you are, what your passion is, and kind of where you're sitting. And so I gather, like, for example, if you're an undergraduate student, you know, there's a really unique way you can engage based upon where you're at. So if you're an undergraduate student, the great thing is there's a lot more near peer ways you can get involved. So if you're going to your, the high school you went through, or your whole back to your own community, you're going to have a really unique street credit to engage and be part of it that a lot of others would not have available, and you're going to really understand a lot more of what the students are than someone like myself. I mean, it's crazy now to think it's like been 20 plus years since I was back in school, and I get more and more detached as I get further along. And so I think having those near peers is phenomenal. And part of it is then maybe linking with a local STEM ecosystem. What am I going to present? Well, there's groups that can help provide ideas of what you might do. But I think it is important to connect with those organizations so that your engagement is going to be as meaningful and strategic as possible, because your time is going to be limited for what you do, and it might as well be something that really fits with a bigger mission or opportunity. But for example, if let's say you're part of a company, industry leader, there's ways that you might be able to really take people inside your company and interview people. Maybe it's day in a life of a STEM professional and helping to get that word out and building that architecture. So I don't know if it's something in the chat. I love to see like people interacting back and forth, like, what do you based upon our conversation, start writing out in the chat what you're thinking you might want to do and kind of who you are, and we could even provide recommendations based upon that. But yeah, I think if this panel gives an opportunity for you to just get excited and roll up your sleeves and get involved, that's great. If it's from a policy perspective, you want to go start meeting your local state legislatures, and then it's okay, we'll talk to a local ecosystem of what are the priorities and what do they really want to get out there. And if you're in a certain legislative district, that's going to move miles in terms of being able to talk and be a constituent and say, this is important to me and my district, especially if a district that's not covered. So just a lot of different ways, but it really is thinking about what do you want to do, what's your passion, and how does it link with something that's going to feed yourself and then also connect with those orgs.
Yeah, no, that's a great perspective. And if you are interested in the sort of advocacy side of things, I will again refer to the ESAL has some great resources around how to do some of those things step by step. And then I think Kayla, we'll jump to you.
Sure. So I'll take a little bit of a different approach here, because I agree with everyone that's spoken so far. Look what's out there, get involved. There are so many efforts across the country, in your local environment, that are probably already taking place that you may not be aware of. So start there first. But then my recommendation as someone that did start an organization is to get specific. So when I started, we were called the Oklahoma Science Project, and we knew that we wanted to do something. We wanted to make an impact. We weren't exactly sure, what that was going to be or what we had to offer. we did a lot of research on the specific issues that were happening in the state of Oklahoma. We found out about 4-day school weeks. We figured out which districts were affected by those. We figured out which districts had the highest number of emergency certified teachers that, you know, may be looking for materials that were low barrier to entry to use in their classrooms. You know, and we looked at test scores from district to district. We looked at the districts that, you know, may really be looking for extra resources or people to reach out to them, you know, and help them specifically. So we did that research. We reached out there. We also paid attention to, you know, from an economic standpoint, what are the needs in the state of Oklahoma? So right now, Oklahoma actually has the highest number of unfilled jobs for folks with just a little bit of STEM college education, not even a full degree. Tons of open jobs that can't be filled with someone that have some technical skills. So we played specifically to that. We talked to local legislators, local programs that were trying to hire these folks. You know, what are your needs? And then we made programming really specific for that. So yeah, just if you are going to do something on your own, do your research first. Get specific before you use your too much time doing anything else. And I highly recommend getting involved in other efforts first. I volunteered for a lot of programs in Boston that outreach to students first. I figured out what they were doing, what worked, and what aspects of being involved in those programs I most enjoyed, which was really important for figuring out the next step forward for me getting involved in STEM education.
Yeah, that's great. That's such an inspiring example of the program you started. And I know that Kayla mentioned to me that actually Code Sci Lab is currently looking for volunteers. So if you are in the computer science space or interested in like science education outreach, you should definitely get in touch with her. And there's an email on that resource document that you either have or I will send to you where you can touch base if you are interested in that opportunity. So we're going to transition to audience questions, and I've seen a couple in the chat already. And then I'll encourage folks to put questions in the chat as Jeremy recommended. If you want to, tell us a little bit about who you are and the types of opportunities you might be looking for, that would be great. So we had an earlier question in the chat that was a reaction to what Andres mentioned. How will students and parents get exposed to science if the district doesn't teach science as a content area or a course like ELA and math? So this audience member said that in my district, science is taught as a subject of 57 minutes in grades 7 and 8 only, and comparing that to in Asian countries where science is starting in much lower grades. So as someone who's kind of thought a lot about this sort of education curriculum piece, yeah, what is your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, this is Jivy, that's a great question, and it's also the problem. I think that in our country and in schools there are, because we have an accountability system that measures literacy in math, you sort of you teach what's being measured, and we don't have. We have state assessments for science, but we don't have the kind of accountability for science the way we do for some of those other subjects. And so it goes by the wayside, unfortunately. This is a problem. It's a big problem. And I think the fact that you all have even 57 minutes in grade 7 and 8 is amazing. Yeah, one of the things that the National Academies, the Board on Science, is going to be releasing in the fall is not only the quality action report that they did, but what we need to do for pre-K through 5 to really get more attention around science for pre-K through 5. Obviously, that's something that we want to do. That's something that we need to do. And that's something that we need to advocate for as citizens of science, as people interested in science, but as a way of ensuring that we have a really good, stable workforce, and that we really are developing citizens that are critical thinkers, which is really important for our country. It's not just important for STEM. So I'm hoping all of that is emphasized.
Yeah, no, that's great. Any other panelists want to chime in around this question of sort of emphasis on STEM in school? We have other questions that are coming in, so we can also move on. So there's another question around, is there any resource that can be used to get ideas to implement in STEM education? So I think that could be either like ideas for, I mean, Kayla already touched on how to think about ideas for actually like implementing a program, but that could be perhaps around resources like content types of resources. I think it was Parveen, feel free to clarify if you had something specific in mind. Yeah, anyone want to jump in and take that?
I'll just mention, some of the research that we did, there are a lot of educator message boards online. I spent a lot of time stalking educator message boards on Facebook, on Reddit, where teachers are sharing resources. They're saying, hey, I'm specifically looking for this assessment, and they're talking back and forth with each other. That was a really interesting process. And once we kind of launched CodeSci Lab, a huge thing we did, we spent years just testing, meeting with groups of teachers, talking to them about what do you need? What are the barriers that you face in your classroom? How can we make this easier for you? We tested our website with them. We tested our website with students, and we assessed, students before and after we, gave them these assignments. And so I think, a lot of it is just, talking to folks in your community. What do they need? And what is it specifically that you can use with your, skill set or background that you may be able to provide?
Yeah, right. Those are both great answers in terms of sort of content based and thinking about like filling in the gaps if you're planning a particular initiative. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I want to say that there's a group that's open, it's something called Open Sci Education, Open Sci Ed, that has lots of free resources for science, mostly in middle school right now. They're designing work for high school. Right now they finished biology and chemistry, but Open Sci Ed has free resources for those who are interested in teaching science. The other piece is my organization, the Education Development Center, edc.org. It's a complicated website to get through, but within there are lots of materials. We've been around for 60 plus years doing science and math development. So we have something called Insights that's online, which has been taught in the elementary grade. We also have things for pre-K through second grade science and math, and that's available on the website somewhere. So
That's great.
I just shared Lab Exchange, which is a really neat resource that came out of Harvard edX, and they are a database basically for a lot of different educational resources. You can search by topic, by grade level. And they also have made some really neat demos on their website where you can go through complete molecular biology bench experiments online and try these things out.
Any other thoughts? I know there's other websites like Science Buddies, and another thing, speaking from personal experience, I was actually involved in the same organization that DePauli was. It's a Harvard-based STEM high school education program. And one thing I found is that we spoke with a lot of groups who are either like working to start similar initiatives, or we spoke to other groups. And I feel like within that sort of informal STEM education, there's a very like free flowing sharing of information. So another thing I would say is if you're either interested in starting something, or if you have an initiative and you're looking for content or ideas, like don't hesitate to reach out to other groups for sharing resources, because I found that to be a really open community and just an amazing source. Can't get better than getting from people's sort of personal experience about what works and what doesn't. I think unless there's any other last thoughts, I might move on to the next question. We had another question. How can you design formative assessments for STEM-based high school physics courses? So interesting, pretty specific question. Anyone has thoughts on that? Or like Andres, do you have any thoughts sort of generally on STEM education assessments and data?
There are some performance-based assessments that are being developed. Some of them are out already, and some of them are being developed along for the next generation science standards around physics and chemistry. There's a group in Stanford called SCALE, S-C-A-L-E. That's part of the Learning Policy Institute. I'll find that and put that on the chat. There's also folks at the University of California, Boulder, doing some really terrific work around physics and biology. They have the curriculum out, and they are currently doing performance-based assessments. They're not doing formative assessments. Formative assessments are sort of embedded within the curriculum design, but I think people are sort of trying to move toward performance-based assessments for science these days. So hopefully that will catch on. But people at CU Boulder will know about the formative assessments if there are any out there.
Great. And Dipali also put a link in the chat related to this as well from Step Up. Any other thoughts from panelists? Another question. Oh, here's there's another question related to this problem of the emphasis of STEM in kids' curriculums, and the question of is one solution like parents choosing homeschooling or more STEM-based magnets or charter schools, and this is my own addition is maybe contrasting that with like all of you are involved in various ways in more informal STEM education as sort of a supplement. So I feel like there's those two sort of solutions, the sort of alternative schooling, informal based science. So anyone want to speak to that? Maybe I saw a nod from Jeremy. Do you want to start?
I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot of, so if you look at some of the data, like a lot of the work says like 95% of lifelong learning happens outside of the school. And so I think the idea of, like you said, really taking advantage of these experiences, going to your local science centers, going to science festivals, going to libraries, a lot of actually, it's interesting, if you look at, when we looked at some of the events that we had in Arizona, it consistently grew where now the majority of almost events as a number are actually through the libraries. And so there's a lot of opportunities through these informal places. You can go to parks and nature centers, but there really is a lot to really emphasize in terms of the importance of that informal. So yeah, you totally hit it right on the mark from our perspective.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? Either informal, oh, Monica.
Yes, I mean, I just think, as a former school board director, there are, thinking about the STEM-based magnet schools, those are different because those are really specific. But if we're looking at homeschooling or other schools, they might not necessarily be focusing more on STEM than you're already getting. So I do think that focusing on the extra outside of school activities that you can access that are in the community to provide more supplemental STEM education. And then also, schools, as a school board director, it's not, if you have a program that you've seen at other schools, I wouldn't say no if you were interested in bringing that program to our school district or trying to provide more after school programming that went around it. As just thinking about, we're always looking for other opportunities to expand. And if there's volunteers who are looking to help the school district expand those, I'm sure your school district would probably be interested in it also. So there's several different avenues that you can go about.
Yeah, thanks for that. Any other sort of perspectives on this? I don't see any other questions in the chat. Feel free to keep, put if I missed one, feel free to repeat it, or we'll continue to take questions. I actually have a question since we have a little bit of a gap. That I'd love to hear from folks. As scientists, I think we all really like data. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on the use of data, either in assessing like the current state of science education in your community, or assessing the effectiveness of STEM education programs. I guess I'd be interested to start with Monica from a policymaker perspective. Like, how much does sort of looking at the data come up in your discussions, and what perspective do you bring to that table as a scientist sort of sitting at the policymaker's seat?
Yes, so when we think about, I guess, in terms of STEM education or just in data generally in my job, where I sit, so there's two different pieces to it. There was what I was doing on school board, and when we're thinking about STEM education and looking at the data and looking at different programs that are out there. So for an example, my school district, where I was a school board director, and we looked at trying to figure out ways of how we can improve and supplement STEM education, whether that's after school or in the summertime. And the school district went out to bring in Camp Invention into the school district to expose the students to this opportunity, and which is free of cost for students in the school district. And from a county council level, I like to look at data in everything that I do, because I am a scientist. I want to look at the data, look at the research, and then figure out which way we're going with our policy. In terms of looking at, for us, one of our big issues that kind of involves STEM in our area is that our county was the largest county in the country that didn't have a health department. And by population, we have about 565,000 individuals in our county. And so looking at that, and then before COVID, we knew that that was an issue, and looking at the data to help us assess, okay, this is why we need to have a health department, because we have these health disparities that exist. We have these issues that exist in our community. And so using the data to really guide our decision-making is something that our full council likes to do, but especially because I'm bringing my research background, it's what I look at for any decisions that I do.
Yeah, well, that's a really cool perspective to hear. I guess, Jeremy, I really liked in your bio, you had a lot of like quantification of the impact of different programs. Maybe can you speak a bit to the use of data in thinking about like program evaluation and the initiatives you've been involved with?
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting kind of going from a, perspective where I, was in a lab and we would have pretty concrete data. We do an assay and it's just like there, and the data is pretty simple. And I think going into the space where it's more, there's people involved, there's social sciences involved, the data is not always as clear. And I think it's, there's a lot of demand for the data and yet not really realization of kind of what it would take to collect it and what it means and how it might be biased. And so I think it's a pretty complex, it's been, the main summary for me is it's a lot more complex than that. Like for example, we were, doing a really detailed report for our science festival and trying to talk about, surveys and people in the public and what they thought about it. And the part for me, we spent a fair amount of money paying an evaluator to get the data, and yet people didn't really even read the report. And part of it is a lot of the companies that funded us had very specific things that they wanted. And so I think the part which is really interesting coming from this perspective is that I think people want data for different reasons and where it's going. I mean, you could even say, well, let's look at the data and kind of, you could evaluate a teacher and how that teacher is doing in terms of test scores. And it's not really looking at a lot of the factors of, well, what type of environment are they in? What are they dealing with schools? And I was even in a conversation the other day looking at SAT and ACT scores, and are they really an indicator of success for college? Or are they more based upon the amount of, SES status and kind of the ability to study for them? And so I think it's kind of taking data with some scrutiny of what it is. But on the other hand, it is important to track and, what we do. Anyway, I don't know if I'm putting insight on it, but I would say it's a lot more complex than doing an assay in the lab.
Yeah, no, that's a very great perspective. I'll move on to Andres. I know at EDC, there's a lot of work around using data to sort of look at education policy, and I'd love to hear about some of those initiatives there.
Yeah, I've only been there 4 months, and there are lots and lots of projects there. I'm trying to wrap my head around it, but one of the things that they do believe in is something called Data for All, and it's a really an initiative around making sure that data and data literacy are actually emphasized in the body of work that's going on. One of my colleagues has done work really working in communities using census data to do a lot more analysis around racial equity, and really looking deeply within that work. So she's gotten some funds to do that. Really fantastic work. Those are the ones that I know about right now. One of the things that I wanted to respond to in terms of your last question, in terms of data, was Barbara Means, when she was at SRI, and she's now at Digital Promise, did a very interesting report on what STEM schools are, high schools. You know, what are STEM high schools? What do they look like? What is a STEM high school like? What is that? What are the components of it? And what are the qualities of different STEM high schools? How do you know one when you see one, besides the fact that they're called a STEM high school? As you can imagine, just being called a STEM high school doesn't mean that there's STEM work going on, but it's pretty sexy. But anyway, that, you know, folks should try and take a look at that. I'll see if I can find that online somewhere and send it around.
Yeah, that's great. If you also send it to me afterwards, I'll include it
Sure.
on that sheet.
I'll also just want to
Yeah.
say, for those of you interested in data and the work that EDC is doing, go to edc.org. There's no shortage of data work that we're doing. It's just I don't quite know all of them, to tell you the truth.
That's great. Kayla, any thoughts on this in the work you've done and researching for your initiative, or thinking about the context?
So like I said, I mean, data was a huge driver for figuring out, you know, what is the problem that we're looking at? How are we going to approach it? So we used our research skills to approach the problem, figure out a solution. And then, you know, we found out, just as, you know, founding a nonprofit, going through an incubator at the university, these kind of things, data becomes really important in trying to share your message. So you can really leverage data. It will stick with people. When I say something like 20% of Oklahoma schools only have 4-day school weeks, that sticks in people's brains, right? That's a wow moment when they hear it. So you could really leverage data to help sell your story. But then also, you know, in making our lessons and assessing them, we use data every step of the way. So measuring student success, but also, as Jeremy mentioned, that social science data becomes really important too. A lot of our data is open-ended questions, you know, especially in surveying teachers, asking about their needs, asking about how our resources meet those needs. We're really having to think about, you know, taking these more nuanced answers into consideration. How do we respond to that? Where, you know, most of us are geneticists and molecular biologists that started this, and we're much more used to looking at those really, you know, analytical endpoints. So it's been really interesting to use, you know, data in all of these things. And then of course it becomes very important in things like applying for funding. You know, every stakeholder that you meet, as Jeremy mentioned, is looking for a different data point. So usually when we go into a conversation, if we're meeting with, you know, a school principal or something, we kind of, you know, preface our conversation with, you know, what's important to you. And so we can go into our meeting with them and make sure that we, you know, answer, you know, those questions, that the most important assessment that they're looking for, right? And it's totally different across the board. It's been really interesting to learn about.
Yeah, no, that's great. So with about 10 minutes left, I'm going to give everyone the chance to say any closing thoughts. We have a couple of minutes per panelist, and I'm actually going to start with Dipali for some reflections on this.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks, everyone. I just, in listening to everybody, had one thing I wanted to call out. I think that across everyone's answers, we've heard a lot about how specific local communities have very specific needs and different ways, like Kayla's given good examples of how to have conversations with teachers and principals and others to really learn. And Monica talked about, going to a school board and hearing what a district is looking for. And I think that as all of us as scientists and engineers, I think there's often a program or an idea we can have that we get really excited about, or the university or the company we work for might have their own agenda for getting involved in science education, and it might be about supporting an actual goal in the community, or it actually might be about image of the university or something else. And so I think just kind of that reminder of always, if you're trying to do something for the community, that you are really talking to people in your community, really getting advice around what the needs are. And I think I've also had experiences of, working on something and realizing that we kind of had a mission where we felt like we were all aligned, and then things can drift over time. So I think just kind of being critical and pushing ourselves to constantly be engaging with a lot of different people and making sure that what we're doing is not just for our fun, but actually sort of meeting the goals we say it's supposed to be.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think that's a super important thing to keep in mind. There are a lot of activities in this space, which is, I think, great, but finding one that making sure that it's actually a good alignment with the community needs, I agree, is super important. Let's see, I'll jump to Andres, your last closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think my closing thoughts is you can both participate in science and volunteer in science. You can also be an advocate. If you have children and they're starting schools, like, ask about the science program. How is that going? Is science taught here? Write write to your local legislators, asking them about the amount of time that's being spent in science, technology, engineering, and math, and ask questions. That helps the enterprise. That could also be enormously useful. I mean, spending time with young people doing volunteer work is one thing, but advocating for the bigger enterprise is just as useful, and we need thousands of you all, thousands.
Yeah, thanks for emphasizing that. I think we included some resources on that sheet, like from the National Science Teachers Association and other groups that have some materials for advocacy efforts if you want to get started in that. And feel free to share with me if other folks know of particular resources or efforts, because I think that's one takeaway I have had, is the importance of some policy issues that without them being addressed, it can be really hard to move forward, especially with formal educational efforts. I'll jump to Kayla.
Sure. So I'll take a little bit different approach. I think there are all of these big ways that we can get involved, but I think some of the most impactful things that I've done have been through one-on-one relationships that I've formed with students who are interested in science. And so maybe you don't have time to, volunteer in a big way, start an organization, do some of these things. But I would, just really encourage everyone to look for the young people in their lives or in their communities that they may be able to form these one-on-one relationships with. There's something just really special when you talk to a student and they can see themselves in you, or they can see that they might be able to go on a similar career path as you or be successful. And you can just see, their face shift or their confidence shift in this. And so I think really just, some of the most impactful things I've been able to do are just these one-on-one relationships, helping students navigate some of these kind of unspoken things in science. How do you write a good letter to graduate school, to get into graduate school? What does your CV need to look like? How do you write an email to a professor to ask them to work in their lab? These kind of things that we all know there's really kind of this unspoken convention to be successful in this. But we don't do a very good job in sharing that to everyone that might want to do it. So I encourage everyone to look for those opportunities.
Definitely, that's great. And there's actually a couple national ways to get involved with that type of thing. There's letters to a pre-scientist where you become a pen pal with someone. I think it's like kindergarten through high school. And then I think it's the social scientist where you can sign up to be a mentor and people may contact you. So there are lots of, even if you don't know where to start within your own community, like national frameworks to do that sort of work too. Yeah, so we'll move on to Monica, closing thoughts.
Yes, I mean, I think as others have said, there are so many different ways that you can be impactful in this area, and really taking a look at what your goals are and where or who you would like to have an impact on in the STEM area. And then looking at your community and what supports are already there, what could you get involved with, or what might be gaps that maybe you can help fill, or see what other stakeholders you could bring in to help fill the gaps that are there. So it's really about, you know, figuring out where your passion is and how you really want to be a part of this and improving that in your community.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And Jeremy, we'll go to you for the final word.
Unfortunately, I had to take something in the family. So what was the question one more time?
Oh, sorry, just final, last closing thoughts.
I mean, I think it's great just to have these conversations and to really figure out kind of what type of ways people can engage, and kind of really have, having these type of conversations, pulling together such a diverse group of people with different experiences, and also the people from the audience to really be part of it, I think is a key part of that next steps of really building that. And then having these in your communities, building it out, connecting. Anyway, I think a lot of it was already said, but appreciate the opportunity to be part of this.
Thank you. I think with that, we'll kind of close it out. Thank you so much to our panelists for spending the evening with us. I know that I found this to be incredibly valuable, lots of resources and discussion shared, and hopefully our audience did too. So we'll be saving the chat, including those additional links in that document that we send around. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or want to follow up. So once more, thank you so much for your time. And I will be also in that final email, I will be sending around a brief survey for some feedback about this event for the audience members, if you have any feedback about how this has been. So again, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your days.